Yeah, shockingly little. Most bee biology with regard to soil nesting bees comes from, individual studies that are done in great detail as to like the architecture of the tumulus and the architecture of the branches where they will put their pollen balls and lay their eggs and for the next generation. But these are typically from one location, these detailed studies. But you know what we're trying to get to is a point where we can think about the nesting requirements of bees across space and even ultimately through time.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Most bee species build nests in small tunnels in the ground that they excavate themselves. And although we're gradually learning more about where these bee species are found by observing them as they visit flowers, we're still at the starting point when it comes to knowing much about their ground nesting biology. Basic things like what kinds of soils do different bee species prefer, when does nesting begin and end, and what's the lifespan of these nesting spots over consecutive generations remains largely a mystery. To help us get a handle on some of these big questions in ground nesting bee biology, we're joined today with Dr. Jordan Kueneman. Dr. Kueneman is a research scientist and director of Project GNBee, which is ground nesting bees. It's a community science project dedicated to the research and conservation of ground nesting bees. So without further ado, let's head underground this week with Dr. Jordan Kueneman on pollination. Welcome to Pollination.
Hey there, good to see you, and thank you for inviting me on.
Well, to set things up, can you describe in broad strokes how bees nest in the ground?
Oh, well, they nest in the ground little by little. So, in broad strokes, there's a few things that we want people to know is that, most bees are solitary. Of the 20,000 species of bees, 90% are solitary and 70% of all bees nest in the ground. So nesting in the ground is
Wow.
really the primary strategy.
Okay, and what are we talking about? Like, how does a bee nest in the ground in the first place? Like, how does it get into the ground?
Well, that's yeah. Well, they start in the ground from the previous generation, so that's important to know, right? So when the weather turns and they get cues to emerge, it's really how do they get out of the ground? That's the first
Oh,
thing.
okay. And how do
And
how do they get out of the ground?
again, little by little, so they are really quite robust in their anatomy and can work their way up to the surface. Some bees can nest, meters down in the ground,
Really?
so it's quite a feat in order for them to find their way up. And then how they get back down is again little by little, digging out, and there's these great little videos that you can find of bees doing this where they're pushing the soil back around them and moving it back out, and then down the hole they go, and they keep that effort going for quite a while.
I have seen, and I know this is maybe a little bit of an aside, but we were looking at some bees from the sand dunes that we have on the Oregon coast, and they have lots of hairs on their forelegs that apparently are used for digging. Is it always just the legs that are the digging implement, or do they use their mandibles, or how do they dig?
I can't speak for all of the bees, but certainly most of the work's done with their legs. Both clawing away from the front, moving it back towards the back of their body, and then pushing it out with their larger back legs.
Okay, great. Okay, so 70%, it's a big part of bee fauna's biology is this nesting in the ground. What are some of the big questions around ground nesting bees that researchers have been kind of vexed with answering, and they're kind of keen to get answers to them? Give us a state of these questions.
Well, mostly people have been studying bees from the context of flowers, right? Observing them and catching them and penning them and studying their biology. So there's always been this missing element, which is where do these bees nest? And they can nest in truly solitary, or one bee, one hole in one location, but they can also form aggregations. And a lot of bees will form these very large aggregations. So generations after generations will come back to the same nesting area in a biological phenomena known as natal philopatry. They'll come back to that same place where they were
Huh.
born, indicates it's a good place, potentially a good place for them to pass on to the next generation. And those aggregations can grow into up to millions of individuals.
Oh, is that right? Okay, so there are these that's great. I'm one of those researchers who spends most of the time looking at bees on flowers. I I sometimes will see a bee nest in passing, but I never return to it. I guess that's one of the key messages that you're sort of hearkening on. There is the bee nest as a kind of a place to go back and sort of think about its broader patterns over time.
Yeah, and what a unique, attribute of bees, the fact that you can go back to that same place day after day and find those bees again, same place year after year and find them again. And so you learn their patterns and their behaviors, and you can start to learn what to expect from a aggregation.
The other thing that you mentioned is they may return because the site has some properties that might be desirable. What do we know about the bees' preferences for, you know, I guess we're talking about soil structure and texture and
Yeah, shockingly little. Most bee biology with regard to soil nesting bees comes from, individual studies that are done in great detail as to like the architecture of the tumulus and the architecture of the branches where they will put their pollen balls and lay their eggs and for the next generation. But these are typically from one location, these detailed studies. But you know what we're trying to get to is a point where we can think about the nesting requirements of bees across space and even ultimately through time.
I have seen some of Bill Steven did a fair amount of work here, and I did inherit some of his casts, his plaster casts of some of the nests that had occurred. So people know like the shape of these things as they dig in the ground, I guess, and as they start to forage for pollen and make those little balls. But the why they're there and
Yeah.
why they chose that spot, that's a big open question.
Yeah, and it's an open question, and because of the limitations of being able to compare one site to another and figure out, okay, how many individuals are in this group? Is that an indication that this is a really good nesting site? What are the traits of that nesting site compared to another one,
Oh.
which might have far less? And what are the attributes of that nesting site? Does it only have to do with floral availability, or does it have a lot to do with the texture that they need, or other attributes that we're not clued into yet?
Oh, that's great, because if it's just a one-off observation on one bee in one spot, you may generalize, and it might have been the worst spot. They're really clinging for dear life there, and you say, "Well,
That's
they
right.
love this place."
Yeah. So, like, so that can't be the end all. So we need to, repeat observations. So for a given species, the more locations where we can find them, the more we can learn about, what are the conditions of those sites and what can that tell us about what are the optimal sites for this species. And they all vary, right? I mean, there are some species that'll nest together, and that has other biological implications, but you know, primarily they're choosing spots specific to their species, so they're cued into different requirements.
All right. Now, you have started GNBees, and it was a way to deal with this that there was very little information on ground nesting bees. And it's an interesting approach because, it employs citizen scientists to be able to try and fill these knowledge gaps. Why do you think citizen scientists would be well suited to this task?
Yeah, because it fundamentally will require a large network of folks and a large participatory group to locate these bees. So I could go out and I might be able to hunt and hunt and hunt and find one or two ground nesting bee aggregations. But the best way to find them is just to reach as many people as possible and say, "Have you looked in your backyard? What's going on in your favorite hiking trails? What are those holes that are surrounding your garage?" or something to that effect, right? Because it's just sort of serendipitous at this point where the bees are nesting because we don't know why they choose those spots. And they're so spread out in the landscape that it's impossible for, a scientist or a group of scientists to get enough information to study them.
Okay, well, walk me through. How do you even find a ground nesting bee? There's all sorts of holes in the ground. It's middle of summer. I see
Right.
holes everywhere. So how do you find a ground nesting bee, and how do you capture the information so that it's, you know, you can really get as much out of that observation as possible, and that the data is good and usable by researchers?
Right. Well, I mean, to start with, there are a few attributes to look for. So most bees, when they form a nest entrance, it'll be around like a number two pencil sized hole.
Okay.
Now, some of them, quite a lot of them will have little mounds associated with it, and that has to do with the material that they've excavated. But it can also wash
Ah,
away.
okay. All right. So that
And then,
as they're digging,
yeah,
there's this dirt that's displaced on around that rim, and so you can pencil like hole lots
yeah,
of dirt. That can be one of the
that's
indications.
exactly. So bigger than most ant nest entrances might be.
Ah, okay.
But what you really are looking for is flight activity. So particularly noticeable in when the species first start to emerge. So it's important to understand that these ground nesting bees, they're very there's so many different species. They're timed with different flowering blooms that occur. So like you can have species that are emerging in the early spring that are timed with early spring flowers such as trees or other just what depending upon the environment you're in, right?
Mhm.
And so when they emerge, they have unique character biology as well. So the males will emerge first and they hover over the area waiting for females to emerge and in order to mate with them. So that's like a number one clued in sign. If you
Okay.
see, bee-like insects hovering over an area, that's an indicator that that's an active aggregation. And then once they mate, the males will die, but the females will stay working in that area for weeks to months until their pollen resources are done. And they're loading themselves up and bringing it back into their nest. And they'll be coming and going, every, 10, 15 minutes, however it is for that species, carrying loads. So when you have lots of bees nesting in a site, you'll be seeing that kind of activity.
What do you do when you go for a walk? I imagine your eyes are darting here, there, thither, whither. So tell us a little bit about like what do you look when you're walking down in a natural area? What are you looking for? What perks your eye up and makes you walk over a little bit for a closer inspection?
Sure. Well, I'm, famously always just trying to see anything that moves, right? Or it's trying to hide. I do have a well-trained eye for amphibians and other animals that most people will walk right by. But in terms of for bees, I'm often looking for some exposed dirt. So that's a good indicator that bees have been active in that area. But also it's easier for them, to excavate in those areas sometimes. And it's also easier for you to see what's going on underneath that, whatever the leaf litter may be or grass layer may be. So I am often looking for exposed areas just because I know that there's likely some activity there. But again, looking for those telltale signs that I mentioned, these little mounds of dirt, number two size pencil holes, and any sort of hovering activity that looks like it could be a bee.
Okay, so you see this. Now, how do you using the platform that you've developed in iNaturals for GNBees, how does somebody capture this information in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, so I mean, iNaturalist makes it really easy, right? I mean, when I started this project, I wasn't even sure how we were gonna, run this platform, and it's like, okay, it's don't reinvent this part of the wheel. This works very well. So really, what we're asking people to do is just take some photos on their phone, and we want photos of the area, but also close-ups of the bees as they're entering the nest, which can be tricky, but is a good activity for folks. And he's like, oh, it's actually hard to be a good naturalist. You have
I've
to
done
be patient.
I've been in this position before. You see the bee go down, and so then you
Yeah,
hover across the entrance with your camera, and then the little head is, like,
yeah.
bobbing up.
Checking to see if you're gone. Well, that's true, and that's true enough. And so, it can be difficult if you're trying to capture a single bee from a single hole.
Okay.
But like I said, these aggregations can get up into the millions. And so if you're in a situation like that, I mean, you're just kind of panning across the area, you'll get a lot of
Ah, okay.
activity. And then there are other tricks, like, if we're just trying to figure out if you're really interested, I mean, you could put a little Dixie cup over it, and sometimes the bee will come back over the nest entrance. Sometimes the bee will come back and start trying to, figure out how to get back into where it wants to go, and that you could capture photos sometimes that way.
Oh,
Or if they're coming out, they get trapped inside and you can kind of photograph them as they're trying to leave. But there's other ways, and I really like encouraging people to use videography as well because you can screen grab from videos, so they can actually help you get an in focus shot,
oh, perfect.
and
Yeah.
and then it's a active aggregation, and there's a lot of movement going on. These slow mo videos on people's phones are really quite remarkable as well.
Now, I always think with iNaturalist that this, for those who are unfamiliar with it, we'll have a link in the show notes, but you can use it on your smartphone, developed by National Science Foundation, and it's just all sorts of things, turtles, birds, earthworms, but holes in the ground. How does iNaturalist deal with holes in the ground?
So they really do require a bee to be present
Okay.
in order for it to sort of easily populate. You can, specify what it is, but it's always better to start with a bee near a nest entrance or the bee itself and then the nest entrance. You can combine these. It's not like you can only upload one photo. You can upload a whole group of them. So, and we strongly encourage people to do that because we not only want to see the bee up close, so we can at least get to the bee genus, but in terms of our identifications, sometimes it's not possible to do the species just from a photograph, but sometimes it is if we know the bee in the region. But we also want to see a little bit of the area, like the size of the aggregation,
Uh,
even what kind of surroundings are there. I usually encourage people to take a photo of the sky, from the nest entrance, so we can see a little bit about the canopy cover. So just some good notes, photographic notes of what the area looked like.
because you could put up to 5 different images on a record in iNaturalist.
Yeah, you must be able to. There's quite a few on there.
Okay, so how does it get associated with this project? Because so I take a picture of a bee and contextual photos, the ground nest, the aggregation, the canopy cover, and iNaturalist says, "Well, it's this bee," and then
Yeah,
how does it now
and then
find its way over to you?
you can tag it. So you can tag the photo to the project, and the name of the project in iNaturalist is called ground nesting bee.
Okay,
So you can tag, and on there it'll prompt you to give an idea of the number of bees, which is helpful because we use that to say, okay, great observation. This is fantastic. Please go back and make another observation next season, or we'd really love it if you could give us a little bit more information about it. And so we use those records to communicate with the photographer, people adding photos, the participants,
oh, so this is
in order for more information, some back and forth that goes on.
oh, yeah, so this is great. So if you're, an amateur naturalist and you're working and you're become real interested, you started, reading about native bees and you make this observation, you may be recruited to do subsequent observations, be able to kind of, like, formulate some questions around what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope, right? I mean, learning about the initial records is really just step one because that's the limiting factor. Where are these guys? And then step two is getting some engagement, having people sort of take on their local aggregation as an naturalist project and start to think about, okay, what other species are nesting in this location?
Huh.
Are we finding the bee parasites of this bee? Adding layers and layers of information. Again, we know, very little about the nesting biology for those species. So there's so much that we can gain.
I recall we're close to campus, we have small Adrena aggregations that pop up every year, and you can see them, they pop up, and then there's the flies that come and the cuckoo bees. It is a very active, bustling little site. There's lots to observe there.
So you would be a perfect candidate. So if you were able to upload an observation, we might reach out to you depending upon where it is and if it fits into, the scope of the next research questions to have you go sample some soil, for example, from that aggregation and send it in to have it analyzed so we can begin to, flesh out what are the soil textures associated with the nesting site.
Amazing. So tell me a little bit about what the response to the project has been so far and some of the things that you've learned.
Well, it's been, very good. You get some people that are the top, responders, and they're going out of their way to track bees down all over the place. And you get other folks that are, have made an observation and that we're trying to work with to get, additional content from. But It's been overwhelmingly positive.
Has there been anything that sort of stands out in your mind of like that was discovered that was sort of surprising to you?
Well, we're still in the very initial stages of trying to turn observations into, you know, answering unknown
Uh-huh.
questions. And there is, time that's needed in order to amass enough observations of a particular kind in order to extract data and then to, find out some new and interesting things about their biology. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different things. I mean, for example, the number of species nesting within an aggregation, I think people have really come to grips with. You see these aggregations and you're like, oh, it's this species of bee. But if you look carefully, I mean, there can be 3, 4, or more different species of bees nesting in that same
Is that
site.
right?
Yeah, so we're
Ah,
learning a bit about that, and we're learning a bit about,
darn.
always when if you go in more detail and you're getting down to the level of brood cell, we learn a lot about, the parasites that associate with those brood cells, learn a lot about how they position them, the depth that they're nesting at. I mean, just really, there's so much that can be learned from studying these sites.
Well, okay, so it sounds real easy to get involved. You get iNaturalist on your smartphone, you take an image, and then you tag GNBees, and that's really how you get signed up?
Yeah, you can tag the project on iNaturalist. It's called ground nesting bee. And that's really how you make, your first observations. And then from there, we're encouraging people to, like I said, become sort of advocates for their local aggregations because it's special and people don't know that. I met somebody in North Carolina that thought, they had an infestation going on
Oh, yeah.
or something, and I was like, "No, actually, this is a really special location." He's like, "Well, I just let them be," and it's like, "Well, thank you, I'm glad that you do that." But other people might not be so open-minded to have their yard turned into the land of bee turrets, for a month out of the year.
I have to tell you, there is here you may know this, but you may not. Oh, way over here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a school, Sable Elementary School, whose mascot is called the Ticklebee because they have ground nesting Andrena on their school grounds, and they've just adopted it as the mascot.
Yeah, I
We're
mean, that's
gonna I'm gonna
wonderful.
send this episode to them directly, and we're gonna get that on the chart there.
See, that's wonderful, and this is another example of if people can, get feedback that it is a special, biological observation that they have, that they can be, the stewards of those bees for that area. Then it lends itself to folks really wanting to advocate for them and protect them, or at least, maintain the management that they've done in the past that it's allowed them to thrive there. And that's what it's all about.
Well, amazing. And with that, I will thank you so much for joining us. And I do want to put the challenge out to the state of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, the Pacific Northwest. Let's get some records into this project. We have some wonderful bees in this area, and it would be great to contribute to this amazing effort to. Oh, and I guess the other question is it just the US or Canada, Mexico?
Well, it's a global
Okay.
global effort for observations because we encourage other groups of researchers in other areas, right, to use this as an infrastructure as a tool in order to study their bees, right? So it's sort of think globally, act locally.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for giving us an overview of this project. And I want to echo out to all our listeners to get their smartphones going, get iNaturalist loaded, and let's get some observations.
Absolutely. And when we get those beautiful photos and those videos, we do a lot of community highlights. So there's an Instagram associated where your photos can be shared, and just wonderful ways to communicate with our audience and share more infographics and updates about the
Oh,
project.
people are
So,
going to want to know what is the iNaturalist? What is the Instagram account?
well, the Instagram is Project GNBee.
Thank you again for your time, Jordan.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you as well.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.